The Subcommittee on Emergency Preparedness, Response, and Communications will come to order. The Subcommittee is meeting today to receive testimony on the Department of Homeland Security's Organization to Counter Weapons of Mass Destruction. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Before I do, I'd just like to recognize that today is a day that President Roosevelt said would go down in infamy. This is the anniversary of the attack of our country at Pearl Harbor in 1941. I'd like us to all keep in mind the memory of those brave Americans who died that day. The Department of Homeland Security was created in response to the September 11 terrorist attacks and the threats to the homeland posed by al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. Since that time, the scope of the threat has changed dramatically. It has become much more diverse and diffuse. We know that terrorist groups have long strived to employ chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear materials in their attacks. There have been documented reports of ISIS using mustard gas in Syria, as well as sarin and chlorine gas used by the Syrian government itself. A plot to release hydrogen sulfide via an improvised chemical dispersion device was uncovered by Australian police. Kim Jong-un had his own stepbrother assassinated using VX nerve agent. A laptop reportedly retrieved from an ISIS hideout in Syria in 2014 contained plans for weaponizing bubonic plague and a document discussing the advantages of using biological weapons. The rapid evolution of new biological techniques, such as CRISPR-Cas9, pose potential threats as the new techniques can be used for both good and evil. North Korea, a state sponsor of terrorism, continues its nuclear tests and has expanded its missile program to such an extent that General Mattis has indicated that now they have the range to reach the United States. The North Korean Central News Agency stated that the ICBM can carry a super-large, heavy warhead which is capable of striking the whole mainland of the U.S. And this is the context under which we meet today. As the world of threats becomes more complex, it is incumbent upon the Department of Homeland Security to assess whether or not it is optimally organized to best confront the variety of threats it is expected to counter. Acting Secretary Duke determined that the Department is, in fact, not currently organized to best address these threats. As a result, on October 6th, she notified the committee of her intent to use her 872 Reorganization Authority to establish a Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction, or CWMD, office, headed by an Assistant Secretary for CWMD. This reorganization took effect earlier this week, and I am pleased that we are joined today by the Assistant Secretary and Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for CWMD, along with the Acting Undersecretary for Science and Technology to discuss this new office. I will note that Acting Secretary Duke realized that her use of 872 authority will only take her so far, and legislative changes are necessary to fully integrate the CWMD office. This committee stands ready to work with the Department on this authorization, as we worked with the Obama administration on their proposal to establish a similar office. Last Congress, the House passed the Department of Homeland Security Cyber Defense Act, authored by Chairman McCall. Based on the Obama administration's proposal, the structure of the office created by the Cyber Defense Act differs from the CWMD office envisioned in the Department's current proposal. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on how the current threat stream informed their proposal and how the organizational structure envisioned in the proposal will set DHS up for success in meeting its vital mission. The Chair now recognizes my friend, the gentleman from New Jersey, the ranking member of this committee, Mr. Payne, for an opening statement that he may have.
Thank you, and good morning. I apologize for my tardiness, but looks like I got here right on time.
You did.
Okay. Well, I want to first thank the chairman for holding today's hearing to assess the department's latest efforts to establish a countering weapons of mass destruction office, CWMD. Great, another acronym. We needed one more. At the outset, I would like to express my disappointment that the department chose to circumvent Congress and unilaterally organize its activities related to chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear CBRNE defense pursuits to Section 872 of the Homeland Security Act of 2002. I appreciate the congressional authorization process takes time, but it also adds value. And this committee has proven itself to be willing to partner when DHS has wanted to reorganize. In 2015, for example, the full committee ranking member and I supported legislation to consolidate the certain CBRNE activities despite warranted reservations because DHS insisted its proposed realignment would improve mission capability. And earlier this year, this committee worked with DHS to draft important legislation to overhaul the National Protection and Programs Directorate, NPPD. To be clear, working with the administration to make DHS operate better is a bipartisan priority. Fortunately, this committee has passed legislation to repeal Section 872, so the department's window of opportunity to use the Homeland Security Act to avoid Congress appears to be closing. Nevertheless, I urge you to work with the committee more collaboratively in the future. I would also like to express my concern that the reorganization was announced when DHS and impacted components lacked permanent leadership. I hope the witnesses here today will help me understand why the department rushed to reorganize without congressional authorization at a time when permanent leaders were in place in only one of the impacted offices. Finally, I look forward to learning more about how the proposal to reorganize CBRNE activities has evolved since 2015. 2 years ago, I was disappointed when prior DHS leadership could not point to concrete benefits it anticipated as a result of consolidating its WND defense's activities. Instead of articulating novel plans to leverage capabilities across the WND mission space, DHS officials spoke in generalities about how reorganization advanced the then Secretary's Unity of Effort initiative and created a central point of contact for stakeholders. Such vague explanations are little justification for setting a disruptive organization in motion. Additionally, I'd be interested to learn how DHS engaged with internal and external stakeholders and whether such engagement informed its reorganization scheme. I look forward to working with the department to ensure the successes of its activities in the WMD space. And with that, I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here today and look forward to their testimony. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Other members of the subcommittee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We are pleased to have a distinguished panel before us today on this important topic. Mr. Jim Mcdonald serves as the Assistant Secretary for Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction and the Director of the Domestic Nuclear Detection Office. Thank you for joining us, sir. Mr. William Bryan serves as the Deputy Undersecretary for Science and Technology and is the senior official performing the duties of the Undersecretary for Science and Technology. Thank you for joining us, sir. Mr. Chris Curry serves as the Director of Emergency Management, National Preparedness, and Critical Infrastructure Protection Issues at the Government Accountability Office. Mr. Curry, thank you for joining us. We're supposed to be joined today also by Mr. Larry Flutie, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for CWMD, but unfortunately an illness has prevented him from being here this morning. We hope he is on the road to recovery and will submit questions for him for the record. The witness's full written statements will appear in the record, and the Chair now recognizes Mr. Mcdonald for a 5-minute statement.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Payne, distinguished members of the subcommittee. It's an honor to be here today to discuss the Department of Homeland Security's work to counter the threat of terrorists using weapons of mass destruction, otherwise known as WMD. Shorten the acronym just a bit. Today, as we discuss the creation of a new organization in DHS, it's on the anniversary of one of the 2 most catastrophic attacks in U.S. history, the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, an attack that caused the United States to enter into a global war that would preserve the freedoms of our democracy. Like Pearl Harbor, 9/11 also began a war to preserve our way of life, a war against terrorism, which continues today. The purpose of the Countering WMD Office will be to work every day to prevent another catastrophic attack, one using weapons or materials that have the potential to kill our citizens in numbers that dwarf previous attacks. In the last year, we've observed a credible increase in terrorist interest in using WMD against the United States. These threats come from all fronts: chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons. Certain WMDs, once thought to be impossible for non-state actors, non-state groups to acquire, are now closer to getting in the hands of terrorists. Today, as you heard in the committee's recent threats hearing, we know that non-state actors have information and technology at their disposal that make the threat much more dynamic, requiring more flexible and aggressive response. The CWMD office is an operational support office. Our mission is to assist the department's frontline operating components, first responders, and interagency partners. We will draw on the WMD expertise within the department and across interagency to integrate expertise and operational support. In planning for the establishment of the CWMD office, Mr. Flutie and I reached out to each of the DHS operating components, interagency partners, and state and local officials to understand their needs and requirements. We are tailoring the CWMD organization to provide the best unified efforts and operational support possible. We're working closely with FEMA to ensure that actions taken by CWMD in support of first responders are coordinated and complementary. Another example of early integration and unity of effort into the larger department is a recent move by OHA and DNDO to embed a core team of WMD expertise in the CBP National Targeting Center. DNDO and OHA leadership have been working closely with DoD as it transitions the CWMD mission from STRATCOM to SOCOM. We are in near daily contact with the Department of Defense and believe this partnership will benefit us in threat awareness and the adoption of new technologies and capabilities that can be developed into homeland capabilities. We're planning against smuggling pathways. Rather than limiting our detection mission to a defense at the 1-yard line strategy, we plan to work through the DHS Joint Task Forces and others to push out capability into known smuggling pathways. We want to deploy into the environment where we know bad guys are operating, be less predictable, and find the threat before it reaches our borders. The CWMD core leadership team brings decades of operational and executive leadership experience. I personally led the development of the WMD capability in the United States Special Operations Command, and Dave Flutie has 23 years as a CBP officer, which includes a detail into the DNDO office when it was stood up. The entire CWMD team has a clear objective to safeguard America and understands their contribution to the DHS mission. The clarity of purpose and contribution to the Homeland Security mission addresses the feedback from our staffs, meetings, and survey results. I take seriously the feedback from congressional oversight bodies, the GAO, and the DHS Inspector General. These bodies provide guidelines and roadmaps to improvement, and I continue to meet with the GAO regularly. I support the findings of the Blue Ribbon Panel on Biodefense and a number of their recommendations. For example, the recommendation to replace BioWatch. I agree with this recommendation. We intend to develop and deploy a system that will be innovative and leverage business practices and the best practices already resident within DNDO. DNDO's solutions development process focuses on gap identification and the development of tangible operational requirements to drive R&D and expeditious deployment of operational capabilities, which will close the gaps and reduce direct threats. This approach has been successful in the deployment of a nuclear detection architecture and will be utilized for a biodetection system that uses the latest technology and shares the information communications backbone that we are already deploying for the nuclear mission. We will optimize the integration of the DNDO solution development process with the expertise that resides in the Office of Health Affairs. This will be done with our existing resources. WMD terrorism remains a pressing issue for our national security. It is with your support that we may build a world-class organization within DHS focused solely on countering the threat of WMD terrorism. I look forward to working with you further on this matter, and I'm happy to answer your questions, any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. The Chair now recognizes Mr. Bryan for a 5-minute statement.
Good morning, Chairman Donovan, Ranking Member Payne, and the distinguished members of the Subcommittee on Emergency Preparedness, Response, and Communications. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. As you know, the Science and Technology Directorate is the research and development arm of the Department of Homeland Security. S&T's mission is to be an enabler. We enable effective, efficient, and secure operations across all Homeland Security missions by applying timely, scientific, and innovative engineering solutions through research, development, test and evaluation, and acquisition support. Since I came to S&T in May of this year, we've been doubling our efforts on satisfying the R&D needs and the requirements of our components. We're working hard to ensure a coordinated and robust program is in place to meet the needs of the DHS operator as well as the first responders. Ever since S&T's inception, we've had a threat-based, varied, and intricate research portfolio in chemical and biological defense. Our example is one example is our portable vehicle decontamination system. The system deploys from the back of a pickup truck. It can clean and disinfect vehicles up to 80 feet long, including the undercarriages and even inside of the animal transport compartments. We transition this product to USDA, which is testing the wash tunnel and the autonomous robots. This project will have a major impact on helping contain the spread of diseases from vehicles moving from farm to farm during an outbreak. We also developed the first ever licensed and approved foot and mouth disease vaccine for livestock and the companion diagnostic kit, now available for the National Veterinarian Stockpile and available for sale internationally. This diagnostic assay product is faster, more sensitive, and greatly enhances the preparedness by decreasing the response times to a foot and mouth disease incursion. Our biothreat characterization program studies a range of biological agents that can be used against us now and in the future. The knowledge gained from this program feeds into the terrorism risk assessments, the TRAs, which we'll be talking about more today, and the material threat assessments, the MTAs. And it has improved DHS's estimate and consequence and risks, the estimates of consequence and risks. Currently, all chemical and biological R&D, including people and resources, will stay with S&T. Historically, the TRAs and the MTAs that are required by presidential directive and the Project BioShield Act of 2004 were previously conducted by S&T. The non-R&D elements of these assessments, such as the coordination with DHS's Office of Intelligence and Analysis for the threat awareness and the threat prioritization, have now been transferred to the CWMD office, while the R&D elements will remain with S&T per the Secretary's guidance. S&T is already working with representatives from the CWMD office to identify the chemical and biological R&D requirements for validation and execution. S&T is committed to ensuring that R&D spending is driven by our components and customers, and that we maintain homeland focused while being more agile and responsive. We will leverage existing technologies when appropriate and clearly define a path for transfer and commercialization of those capabilities. Working together with CWMD, we will apply our science and engineering excellence to counter the threat of weapons of mass destruction against the homeland. That concludes my remarks, and thank you very much once again for having this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bryan. The Chair now recognizes Mr. Curry for an opening statement of 5 minutes.
All right. Thank you, Chairman Donovan, Mr. Payne, Ms. Watson-Coleman. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today. The question of how DHS should be organized to combat weapons of mass destruction has come up numerous times since the department's creation 15 years ago. We at GAO are not for or against the proposed reorganization. Those are decisions for DHS and for you as the Congress to make. Our work is focused more on the why and the how of the question. Our 2016 report evaluated DHS's own assessment of the benefits and trade-offs of the reorganization, and maybe more important for today's hearing, how to implement it successfully. This committee understands well the need to fully assess such a change. you require that DHS better assess it in your recent DHS reauthorization bill you passed this year. And we know at GAO from looking at decades of reorganizations and transformations in government, some good, some bad, that agencies often learn the hard way how difficult these can be. Many of these lessons were learned from the creation and transformation of DHS itself over the last 15 years. The bottom line is that threat and mission need are clearly the most critical factors for this reorganization. However, if there's not an honest recognition of the organizational and administrative challenges and a plan to address it, it'll be way more difficult than it needs to be. In our report last year, we looked into DHS's assessment and decision-making that led to the reorganization proposal. What we found is that there was little actual assessment done. For example, DHS didn't fully assess problems that could occur, didn't fully consider the costs versus the benefits, and conducted very limited outreach at that time to external stakeholders. DHS actually disagreed with our recommendation at the time to go back and do these things. Their position then was a decision had been made, and to go back and further assess it was not necessary. And frankly, this concerned us and didn't sound like a recipe for success. But I'd like to shift from the past to the present. While we have not done the same in-depth audit of the current proposal over the last year that we did a year ago, we've reviewed the Secretary's notice and talked with DHS several times to better understand it. And clearly there are some promising things in this proposal that the previous one lacked. There seems to be a realistic acceptance of past problems that need to be solved. An example of this is the need for a clear focal point in DHS to strengthen coordination and reduce fragmentation. This is something we have long recommended across numerous complicated national security areas, one of which is biodefense. Also, this effort looks to be driven from the components themselves, as opposed to the top-down approach that was taken before from the Office of Policy. However, and emphasis on however, I'm cautiously optimistic. As I alluded to before, the greatest mission need in the world won't overcome the organizational challenges to reorganization. In fact, the hard work begins once the reorganization actually begins. That's why it's so important that DHS apply best practices from prior reorganizations. Some of these will seem obvious, but the key is in the execution. Here are just some examples. Establishing a coherent mission and strategic goals and timeframes to guide the transformation. This will be critical to help DHS meet its broad new goals for chem, bio, and rad nuke defense, and help internal and external stakeholders see that progress as well. Establishing an implementation team and communication strategy for the transformation are also key. This will help build trust and make adjustments if they're needed as they go. The last example is also critical, involving employees to obtain their ideas and gain their buy-in. DHS wants to improve morale through this reorganization in these components. However, morale doesn't go up just because organizations move around. Employees need to understand the vision, be consulted, and see their feedback incorporated into the change. The good news is that DHS recognizes the challenges, we've heard that already this morning, and the importance of these actions. But it will be very important for this committee to monitor the actual execution of the reorganization over the next few years. And of course, we're happy to help you with that as well. That concludes my statement, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Curry. I thank you all for your statements. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. In the past, this committee has done so, and we'll do it again, requesting technical assistance from the department for the CWMD office. I was wondering if each of you could just comment on what legislative authorities you believe will be necessary to fully implement the proposal that we're speaking of today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll start, take that first. We're very close to completing technical assistance language to get to the committee, and I commit to get that to you quickly. We are not seeking new authorities in the WMD space, unlike the previous recommendation, which was essentially a stovepiped approach to chem, nuke, bio, and explosives. We're looking at a much more integrated approach. So as we're doing this, we're taking, for example, the DNDO business model and seeking to apply those authorities across Chem, Nuke, and Bio. So as we do, for example, gap analysis, we can be doing it across the battle space. As you know, we go talk to an NYPD officer. It's not one for Rad Nuke, one for Chem Bio, and one. It's the same officer. It's the same emergency response teams. So we're looking to extend our authorities across the battle space rather than a stovepiped approach as we currently have. We do seek to codify the Secure the Cities program and expand that a little bit in not in scope relative to cost, but in how we do the program, and to reach out more into pathways and approaches into the target areas rather than just focused on the target areas, but to also be able to address any of the priority mission as it comes up.
Thank you. Mr. Bryan?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for your question. And first, let me add that we, as within S&T, we already have the authority for oversight and coordination of S&T or R&D across the department. We specifically already have authority to do R&D in the space of Chem Bio. Additional authorities that would help us not just within Chem Bio, but others. Just a couple requests that I would throw out to you that would enable us to do this better. One of them is the authority to do counter T&E authority for unmanned aerial systems. That seems to be what we believe could potentially be a system to use to actually employ any kind of toxic agents. And right now we can't test UAVs or test that in a relative environment. So that's one authority. That's something that we would really help us out in the area of R&D to be able to, especially in this mission space. There's also other transactional authorities. We already have that, but it's on a yearly basis. So if we should get in any longer-term processes or projects, we would need that authority extended. So if that is something that we could have longer than 1 year at a time, either more permanent or a longer term, would be beneficial to all of our programs within R&D to include the CWMD mission. And also the low-rate initial production authority, the LRIPS. I don't suspect this will be an issue with Jim and the work that they've been doing in DNDO. They understand acquisition. I don't suspect that'll be an issue, but in some cases, having that low-rate initial production authority during that transition from R&D to actual acquisition provides something into the field quickly, even if it's at a low rate, to be able to get it into the hands of the operator.
Would you include all your recommendations in the technical report that we're asking for so that we make sure that we consider all those things that you just mentioned?
Yes, sir, we can do that.
Thank you. Mr. Curry, you have anything you'd like?
Yes, sir. Two things that come to mind. One is, I mean, clearly legislation is going to be needed for the department to fully implement the vision of what they want this office to look like. What they're doing now is shuffling some deck chairs at the top within the organization. So I think in the legislation itself, I think it'd be very important, in addition to just the mechanics behind what is going to be changing and the offices that are going to exist, I think the committee's expectations and the Congress's expectations for how this office is going to operate and how it's going to work with the components and what you expect it to do. Because if it's given a broad mission, but without the authorities to actually do that across DHS and working with much larger components with more resources and more decision-making authority, I think it's going to be difficult for it to establish its place. The other thing is, the second thing is, in addition to just the mechanics of how the organization is going to be changed, is building in some of this criteria for how you want the organization to manage this transformation and how you want it to measure progress, I think will be really important to provide you the ability to actually oversee if it's doing what you want it to do.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. Being the days are so crowded today, maybe we'll get a second round of questions in. The chair now recognizes my friend from New Jersey, Ms. Coleman Watson. Watson Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, for yielding to me. Mr. Mcdonald, first of all, let me say I hope Mr. Flutie is recovering quickly. And secondly, I thank GAO for what seems to be an encouraging prospect for us as we take on this very important issue of reorganization. However, I do have some questions. Mr. Mcdonald, when the committee considered the department's 2015 proposal to consolidate certain chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear activities, Mr. Thompson, our ranking member, expressed concerns about the workforce retention and the morale. The new CWMD, which I also supported, the new CWMD office raises similar concerns. Can you talk about what efforts you are undertaking to preserve workforce morale? And in particular, can you describe efforts to ensure that talented individuals from legacy offices understand the new career paths and opportunities they may have to advance?
Thank you, Congressman Watson-Coleman, and I appreciate the question. We're essentially an intellectual property organization, so the people are the capability. We have within the Office of Health Affairs and DNDO a tremendous amount of expertise and talent that is unique in the federal government, and bringing those together is going to make us a much more powerful organization. As an example, I think in the morale space, the most important thing is communications, people understanding what's going on, and them feeling like they have an input in what the outcome is going to be. The approach that we've taken right now, which has been a very limited change in the senior leadership, as the ranking member mentioned, enables a process that we envision taking several months with a lot of staff discussing how best to optimize this organization. And the real goal is to make them feel like, at the end of the day, they're doing things to keep America safe. They're not just coming into an office and churning and not feeling like there's a positive outcome.
Thank you. It's good to hear that because as Mr. Curry stated, this whole buy-in from from employees is so very important, considering the fact that you do have very high intellectual properties there. That is your asset, the people and their brains and their willingness to work together, but the morale has been a challenge. Also, last Congress, I supported the bipartisan bill to consolidate your office's activities, despite the reservations that we had about advancing the measure without seeing the forthcoming GAO assessment. I'm wondering, and importantly, that analysis indicated that DHS had not done all of its due diligence in its proposal. In October, Acting Secretary Duke notified Congress that DHS planned to unilaterally execute a similar reorganization and would implement GAO's recommendations as the reorganization was underway. Why not fully address those assessments, recommendations prior to executing the reorganization? What is the reason for that?
Thank you for that question as well. I think it's important to note that we see this very much as a two-step process. The initial 872 notification was limited to just the executive leadership. So myself as the Assistant Secretary and Dave Flutie, who is currently running Health Affairs, will be the #2 person in the organization. And we didn't want to get out in front of the committee and other stakeholders and come in with some big elaborate reorganization. We just wanted to get in a position where you could have an executive that you could say, what is the plan for this? How are you working it? Mr. Curry's comments, there's nothing in there that I disagree with that he said. I've personally had 87 meetings since the committee asked for technical assistance on this back in March. I've met with, the first thing we did the other day on the 5th when this became official was myself and my chief of staff walked over to the Office of Health Affairs and had an all-hands meeting.
Have you, I just need a yes or no on this, because I have one more really important question.
Yes, ma'am.
Let me ask that question. First of all, I'm going to want to know whether or not you did entertain the possibility of dealing with their recommendations and findings before actually getting this far. But secondly, tell me about the chief medical officer. In the 2006, Congress authorized a provision of the council, the secretary, and FEMA administrator on public health issues, among other things. Can you confirm that this CMO is going to continue to have direct access to the secretary to advise on these public health issues?
Yes, ma'am. Mr. Chairman, could I use a little extra time to answer this?
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, ma'am. The chief medical officer had a great deal of discussion about how we were going to do that when we started this back in March. then Advisor Duke, before she was Deputy Secretary, said one of the red lines for this organization was to ensure that the Chief Medical Officer function was maintained as a critical component of the organization. The way we've chose to do that, the Chief Medical Officer will continue to be a presidential appointee, very high stature, and have the gravitas and the interagency, and will be the advisor, the principal advisor, to direct report to me organizationally, but much like the FEMA administrator, during an emergency, the FEMA administrator can report directly to the president. We envision the Chief Medical Officer being an asset for the secretary, for the FEMA administrator, for working with Dr. Cadillac over at HHS, but for being the person that can get out there and represent us and make good strategic decisions when it comes to public health issues. The distinct difference from what was before with the Office of Health Affairs is the doctor is not going to be saddled with the administration of an organization. They are going to be free to be the chief doctor for the department and have the freedom to be able to focus on that solely and not worry about day-to-day administration and all the other things that come with line management responsibilities.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, the ranking member, Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. McDonald, as I mentioned in my opening statement, I'm concerned that the department used its Section 872 authority to execute the CWMD reorganization. Should we expect the department to pursue unilateral reorganizations until Section 872 of the Homeland Security Act is repealed?
Sir, I have no direct knowledge of any other intention of using 872. In fact, the discussions leading up to the use of 872 on this one was a lot of deliberation and ensuring that it was extremely limited because we knew that the sensitivities on the Hill relative to the use of that section of the Homeland Security Act. So we really were very cautious in the approach and wanted it to be very limited so we could respect the legislative process in the actual ultimate reorganization.
And why did the department initiate the reorganization under 872 instead of engaging with Congress?
So prior to the notification, so I guess one way to address this best is we were in a transition, bringing on a new leadership team. We had been requested technical assistance on the CBRNE legislation that had passed in 2015. And we wanted to come in with a different approach, but we didn't at the same time want to build with the new organization, knowing that we were going to do a reorganization, build OHA as it had been before and DNDO as it had been before. So we immediately started thinking of how we can do this to unify command and effort, but not get too far out in front and take on new authorities that we don't already have.
So, so I guess what you're saying to me is that to have engaged Congress would have taken you too much time, and you needed to come and engage us would waste some of your time, or
No, sir, absolutely not. And if I implied that, then I apologize.
Oh no, it was no implication. Okay. I was just asking.
No, sir.
You know, and I say that because you know, and you know, as you said, it's a new administration, and you know, there have been some instances where this has played out across the administration and other departments as well. It's a slippery slope. The Constitution of this great nation was put in place for a reason. Congress has its role, and to continually circumvent this body that represents the American people, it's very dangerous and a slippery slope. So I would just suggest to the administration that you know, it tread lightly on this, because it's not the way it's been set up. I understand there are certain times with a department such as Homeland where things have to be done in that manner, but it shouldn't be the precedent, and it should not become the way things are done. I heard you say that you wanted to do things in a different way. I don't know if this is necessarily the best way.
Thank you, sir. May I respond real quick?
Sure.
One thing that I'd like to highlight was in my opening statement, and the chairman mentioned, is the threat that is very real right now, and that is the prime driver for getting us organized in a way to be flexible and be able to respond and deal with the threats that are out there. But again, we wanted to respect the committee and the legislative process and not do too much.
Let's see. Also, in October 2017, DHS notified Congress that it planned to establish the Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Office. DHS sought a similar reorganization of its CBRNE activities in 2015. Can you walk us through the differences in the department's current reorganization plan and the 2015 proposal?
Yes, sir. The 2015 proposal was a stovepiped approach to the organization. In fact, if you look at page 6 of the GAO audit, it shows a series of blocks, and the language in there as far as responsibilities for each office are essentially identical. So you have a bio block that has a policy responsibility, a chem block that has a policy responsibility. And if you really, you look across those stovepipes, it's sort of hard to see any capacity building, any enhancement in efficiencies and capabilities. What we have done is we've said we're going to do a horizontal integration. As an example, I had an all-hands meeting with our acquisition folks in DNDO. I had about 50 people in the room, and I said, so how many people here are actually nuclear experts? And probably about 5 people raised their hand. That means about 45 people in that room are acquisition, program planning, and execution experts. So if I get 5 people from OHA and plug them into that 45-person group, now I've got a 55-person organization that can do nuclear and biological product acquisition and development. We don't need to duplicate the DNDO model for biodefense. What we need to do is take advantage of the things that we already have that are very good, bring the exceptional talent from OHA. So OHA does not have the type of infrastructure and resources that DNDO does to manage big programs and deliver products and services, but they have a tremendous amount of individual expertise. And so what we've done is, instead of saying we're just going to make everything equal, so we're going to get talented people in the same room focused on a problem together.
All right. Mr. Chairman, I apologize. I've gone way over my time as I yield back.
No need to apologize. There is if we can engage you for, maybe we could do one more question each, just because there's a few of us here, and this is such an important issue. You started to describe, Mr. Mcdonald, about that differences. I know the proposal of 2015 divided responsibilities, I guess, by threat rather than by function. Acquisition of resources was one of the reasons why I believe you stated it's better to do it by function rather than threat. Are there other reasons why this is a better method, better structure than the previous 2015 proposal?
Yes, sir. So one, sort of moving left to right across the organization, we actually start in threat analysis and understanding what the battle space is, what adversaries are doing. As we both mentioned in our opening statements, there are terrorist organizations, ISIS, that wants to use chemical, nuclear, or biological. That expertise is one set of folks that we work with. So, for example, at the NCTC, National Counterterrorism Center, they have a WMD organization. They don't have a Chem Nuke Bio organization. The DOD is similar. The FBI, we work with the WMD division. So the people that we have to work with to identify the threat and think about how we're going to deal with the threat and start doing operational plans and support the components are combined. It isn't stovepiped in the rest of the organizations. And as I mentioned, a first responder, a member of a bomb squad, I had the privilege of visiting the stabilization team up in New York City that the NYPD and Nassau and Suffolk County works with the FBI on. Those guys, they respond to a device. It doesn't matter what type of device it is. So we want to have a business model that provides support to the folks that are in the field and allows us to interact with other people. But it just doesn't make sense to duplicate everything and just have a, build another organization that's not necessary.
Wonderful, thank you. You visited us in New York during that. The other thing, Mr. Bryan, I've had the privilege of visiting was New Steel and the work that they're doing in the lab in New York. How will their work support, supplement, enhance what you guys are doing at Science and Technology in this area of weapons of mass destruction?
First, Mr. Chairman, I do want to thank you and the committee for your support, the labs, and your recognition of the importance that the labs bring to this mission space. As you know, New Steel provides a lot of products and services, primarily to the first responders, to help them in their role to protect, respond, prepare for Homeland Security threats. We also conduct a lot of tests, evaluations, and assessments of first responder technologies using our full spectrum of laboratory capability and field testing services. Unique and special, I think, to the area of CWMD is we are the DHS, New Steel, I should say, is also the DHS sponsor for R&D for the response and recovery part of the RAD-Nuke mission. So both New Steel's test and evaluation mission, the R&D sponsorship piece of that, will need to be closely coordinated with the CWMD office to ensure that we minimize any duplication of effort and ensure any seamless unity of effort. So I would defer to my colleague if there's any other views he has on the utilization of New Steel.
I thank you for your insight, and I yield the balance of my time, and I ask my friend from New Jersey if he has one final question before we let you guys get out of here within the hour that I promised you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Curry, the last time DHS sought to consolidate its sea-burning activities, many touted potential cost savings resulting from efficiencies. From your previous review, do you anticipate any cost savings associated with this kind of reorganization?
In short, no. When we looked at it in the past, well, the problem was there was no cost-benefit analysis done, so there was really no data or information to see whether there was going to be cost savings. There were high-level statements made in certain documents about streamlining and cost savings, but we didn't see any data that backed that up.
Can you describe some of the potential costs agencies incur as they undertake reorganizations?
Sure. Well, a lot of it tends to be administrative sometimes. So sometimes there's a conception that when you put organizations together that somehow they're going to immediately streamline, but sometimes that's the opposite. When you put organizations together administratively, especially at first, sometimes you need more support.
Right.
To support more people, for example, in your human capital office, or more IT services, or if you expand your footprint where people are located in buildings, you have to expand, your support structure for that. So sometimes we've seen in prior reorganizations that when there's an assumption there will be no cost just because existing organizations come together, that's not always true.
Okay. All right. Well, Mr. Chairman, since you promised them that we'd be done in an hour, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. I want to thank all witnesses, first of all, for your service to our nation. You are charged with protecting our homeland. There's no greater cause, and the sacrifices in time and probably compensation and other matters in which you and your families are willing to endure for the safety of our families is much appreciated. Also like to thank you for your valuable testimony today and for answering our questions in a forthcoming manner. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for our witnesses, and we will ask that you respond to these in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7E, the hearing record will remain open for 10 days. Without objection, the subcommittee now stands adjourned. All right, now we're efficient anyhow, right, buddy?
Absolutely.